runs 8 to 8:50 a.m. and is the volunteer lake level monitoring for management and research presentation. Our presenter is Katie Hein, the Lakes Monitoring and Technical Lead with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Katie is a statewide lake monitoring lead, a Wisconsin native. She loves Wisconsin lakes and strives to develop new monitoring efforts that will help restore and protect these treasures. And with that, I will let Katie take it from here.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, I'll be talking about lake level monitoring today. And just to start off the topic, I've got a couple pictures. Okay, now it's being delayed again. We'll see if I can advance the slide. There we go. Okay. So as many of you know, in the last couple of years, we've had flooding conditions. This is a picture I took of Lake Monona in downtown Madison on my way to work. And basically both 2018 and 2019 had really high water levels. We'll likely still have high water levels this year. And I'm sure many of you on the call have been experiencing this in your own backyards. But I also wanted to point out that just a few years ago, about 10 years ago, well, let's see, this is kind of throwing me off, I have to admit. There's quite a delay to advancing the slides. In 2010, there was a drought in northern Wisconsin, and rather than being concerned about high water levels, a lot of people in the state were concerned about low water levels. So, again, and this is a picture of a lake up in Vilas County. So we can see that lakes do naturally fluctuate. Sometimes they go quite high, sometimes quite low. And today I want to talk about kind of these natural lake level fluctuations in general, what we can expect, what kind of lakes fluctuate a lot and which fluctuate a little. And then I'll be talking also about how these fluctuations affect lake ecosystems, why we need the data, and then how you could actually get involved in collecting lake level data yourself as a volunteer, and then how we can better adapt to these fluctuating lake levels. So that kind of gives you an outline of the topics we'll cover today, and I'll just jump right in. You can see these are a few examples of some sites where you can see the lake under high water conditions at a particular location and then under low conditions in the bottom. Again, just to point out that these large fluctuations can occur naturally. And this is just a schematic showing this change over time. So you have your average lake level, but then the nearby forest can flood, and then you can also have these infrequent lows. And actually these fluctuations themselves can be really important for the plant communities and for the wildlife. For example, bulrush is an emergent plant that's often near shorelines. It provides really good habitat for wildlife, and it needs dry conditions to seed and germinate, but then it needs the flooded condition to live. So that fluctuation itself is really important. And this is some research that's been ongoing by Martín Perales, who's a doctoral student at UW-Madison. And he looked at a bunch of lakes in Vilas County to see, okay, so we know lake levels fluctuate, but by how much? And is there variability in between lakes as far as how much they'll vary? And it turns out there is. You can see each point on this map here is a different lake, and the yellow is showing lakes that only really don't vary at all over time. But then the dark purple here are lakes that change by over a meter, so more than 3 feet of vertical elevation change. And this was the one way he did this was he looked at the lake level of a bunch of lakes in 2005, which was a high water year, and compared it to the lake level in 2010, which was when that drought was going on. One of the other interesting findings that he had was that a big uh, a big determinant of if the lake would fluctuate a lot or a little is if it's a drainage lake or a seepage lake. So a drainage lake is connected to other water bodies with a stream or river. And so the drainage lakes, you can see here on the left, this is a lake level change from 2005 to 2010. So the water level goes down a little bit, but not very much in most of the drainage lakes. So that river is sort of modulating the change and still providing water to the lake even under drought. With the seepage lakes, you can see a lot of variability, but for the most part, they change quite a bit. And some of these, again, by more than a meter of change, so more than 3 feet of change. Even if you look at all the diamonds here, our seepage lakes, even though they are mainly the reason why you see bigger lake level fluctuations, there's still variability within seepage lakes. And so some of the other things you've found is that how high the lake is in the landscape and whether there's wetlands around the lake, and some other things like soil permeability around the lake can determine how much the lake will fluctuate, how dramatic those fluctuations will be on the seepage lake. Okay, so we know that lakes can vary. This also drives home that point. This is some long-term data. So Martine's work just looked at comparing a wet year to a dry year. This is looking at a few sites in, again, northeastern Wisconsin, where we had long-term records of water levels, both in a couple of seepage lakes and then also in the groundwater. And you can see this obvious cycle where in some years the water's high, then it goes down, and then it goes back up again. Well, it turns out this is about an 11 to 13 year cycle, which actually I was thinking about that. So we saw the drought picture from Vilas County in 2010. It's about 10 years later now, and we're seeing floods. So that kind of fits with this cycle that Carl Watrous and others found. And I think, well, and again, here, the other point I just wanted to make is looking at the scale of change here. So this is about 100 centimeters. So again, it's about 3 feet of change that you can see in some of these seepage lakes and in the groundwater table. So Zhuzhan Wu, I know, Zhuzhan, you're on the call. A few of us started to work with these long-term lake level records, and we compiled as many as we could in the state to see, well, can we predict lake level change, and what drives the lake level change? And so you can see some of the collaborators down here at the bottom of the slide: Noah Lodig from UW, Bob Smale from DNR, and others. We basically gathered all the records we could from the state, and we were able to develop a model that works quite well. This is showing you one example. This is Anvil Lake from Vilas County again. And the black dots show the true observed water levels on Anvil Lake, and the blue points show our model predictions. And so, you can see they fall on top of the black ones pretty well. Basically, Bob came up with this idea that we could predict lake levels just by using precipitation data, which is not too surprising. So when it rains more, the lake levels go up, and when it rains less, the lake levels go down. But the interesting thing is that if you just use precipitation data from like the same month, that it doesn't correlate very well with the lake levels. The lakes have memory. It takes them a while to respond. And so what the metric is here that's actually predicting lake levels really well is the 8-year cumulative deviation in precipitation. So essentially over the last 8 years, if it's been raining more than normal continuously and kind of building up, then you're going to see the lake level go up. If it had been raining less for the last 8 years than normal, and then you're going to start to see a response in the lake. So that's pretty interesting, and we're hoping this can be a really good tool for us to better understand how lake levels are changing in places of the state where we don't have much data. And then another thing that's rather interesting to think about. So we see that precipitation, of course, is really driving lake level fluctuations, but we know that our climate is also changing. And so we could think about how is that going to affect lake levels in the future. If the precipitation changes, then we should expect the lake levels will also change. So this is just on the left here showing a map of the observed change in annual average precipitation from 1950 to 2006. And so these red areas are places that have gotten drier from the 50s to more recent time. The blue have gotten wetter. So you can see that in most of the states, the green to blue areas, Wisconsin's getting wetter. There were some areas in the north here that had gotten drier. That was leading up to the drought in 2010. So again, you could think of, okay, so we're going to see these fluctuations, but then we might also see in some of these areas that lakes will be higher. And their highs will be a little bit higher and their lows will be higher than in the past, or somewhere the highs and lows might be lower. Okay, and another thing on the map here on the right is showing high capacity wells. Another thing that we're looking into is how does groundwater pumping and water use affect lake levels. Of course, if you're bringing down the water table, then you can be bringing down the lake levels as well. So all of this sort of drives a need for better monitoring of lake levels and better understanding how these changes, like climate change and water use, could be affecting lake levels. I think I will pause here quick to see if there were any questions that came in on this so far.
Yeah, no, I didn't see any
Okay.
questions in the chat box so far.
So then I will talk about how just a few studies from Wisconsin in particular, where we're seeing how lake levels can affect the lake ecosystem. So I've got 4 stories to share with you. One is on water clarity, one on mercury bioaccumulation and walleye, one on largemouth bass fisheries, and then on invasive rusty crayfish. So this will be a really quick overview. I did a study with Peter Lisi, who was a postdoc at UW-Madison, on this water clarity story. Isn't that funny? Sometimes this is really delayed in advancing. So I'll just try again here. Well, hopefully this will advance and I can keep talking. The Pete Lisi's family lives in northwestern Wisconsin, and they are volunteer monitors for Secchi depth, and so that's what the pictures here show, the Secchi disk, which is a way to measure the water clarity in the lake. And he was interested in looking at how does lake level fluctuations affect water clarity. And I got involved in helping him pull together some of the data records and doing the analysis. We were able to gather a group of lakes from that area and look at long-term lake level records as compared to water clarity records. And what we found was kind of interesting. There were 2 different classes of lakes. And on the left here, you see that some lakes became more clear in drought years when the water levels were low. These tended to be more oligotrophic lakes, so not very much algae in the lake, and they stratify in the summer. And so what we think the mechanisms going on here, that if you're in a drought, there's less precipitation, less water running off of the land, and so there's less phosphorus and soil kind of getting washed into the lake. And so then you don't have as many algal blooms and you don't have as much sediment sort of suspending in the water. On the flip side, this was what surprised us. Some lakes actually became less clear during the drought. These were really different types of lakes, though. They were more eutrophic lakes, so they already had more algae in the water, and they were polymictic. That means that they keep mixing, like the water column has the same temperature throughout the summer. And we read into this a little bit more, looking at examples from elsewhere in the world, and what we think is going on here is that when there's a drought, the lake levels go down, the water gets warmer, it's kind of becomes more stagnant, and you can get more concentrating, like a concentration effect. So the nutrients concentrate, the algae concentrate, and the water clarity goes down. So that was rather interesting, and it does seem like anecdotally it fits with what some people have been observing over the years in their lakes that they're monitoring. All right, another study that came out recently was on mercury bioaccumulation and walleye. And what they found is that yeah, here it is. Oh, well, now we go really far. That is not happening to me in the practice. I'll try to go back.
Katie, it just says on my end, waiting for Katie to control your screen. So that usually just means touch anywhere in the middle of the screen with your mouse.
Oh. Oh, I wonder if it's kind of been, yeah, now it's advancing quickly. Okay, good, thank you. Maybe I need to touch it once in a while if I haven't moved the slide. So, okay. Here, basically, the walleye, the main take-home message here is that when lake levels go down, which is this, these open circles here, the mercury concentration in walleye is lower, but when lake levels go up, the mercury concentration in walleye is higher. And so we can see again this cycling that this was another study by Carl Watrous. The cycling in lake levels is also showing up in the mercury concentration in fish. And I'm not going to get into the mechanisms today, but there are some ideas about why this is occurring. But it's basically the chemistry of the lake is changing with the lake levels and recycling and making the mercury that's already in the lake more labile and more able to be become kind of part of the food web and get into the fish tissue. Another study will focus more on this drought. I showed you this picture before where you see all of these big logs that are exposed when the lake level goes down. Well, that woody habitat is good habitat for fish, and especially prey fish like perch. They can hang out by that wood and get some cover and prevent getting eaten by something like a largemouth bass. And so what they found in this study is that when the lake levels go down, there's a lot less wood in the water because it's out here in dry land, and the predation effect becomes really intense. And so basically here on the left, they see, okay, perch like to hang out where there's more wood. So this is showing you there's the woody habitat density. So only like 200 pieces per kilometer versus 650. And this is the probability of catching yellow perch in traps. And the probability is 100% if you get up to these high densities. So basically the yellow perch want to hang out in the woody habitat areas. And what they find is that if they don't have the wood, then the bass can eat them up really quickly. So essentially you get some good bass growth rates immediately after that, but then they've kind of eliminated their prey resource, and you start to see growth rates of bass slow down. So that's what this one's showing over here. If you, this is the length of the bass and this is the age of the bass. So if there's a lot of wood in the lake, they grow quickly. This is the minimum length limit here. But if there's not very much wood in the lake, they kind of grow and then slow way down and never reach kind of the game fish size that you would harvest, to eat. So, essentially this is a story about when lake levels go down, the habitat that's good for perch is reduced, and then you get these intense predator-prey interactions between bass and yellow perch, and eventually later on the bass just don't have much to eat. Another story is again from Vilas County on Sparkling Lake, where actually I did my master's work studying the invasive rusty crayfish. So rusty crayfish were really abundant in that lake. And one thing that, and this is a lake with one of their long-term ecological research sites. So they've been able to look at crayfish abundance over time in conjunction with water levels. And this is kind of interesting because what they see is that you can see water levels go up and down, and rusty crayfish abundance goes up and down. But if you just kind of do a lag effect of 3 years, you can line these two curves up with one another, and they kind of go up and down in concert with one another. There is some, you know, this is not just randomly chosen of 3 years. So if you think about it, there's all this cobble habitat, and that's really important for rusty crayfish to rear their young. You can see a crayfish here, this would be a female, and if you turned over her body, you could look on her abdomen and find a bunch of eggs or larval crayfish. So they rear their young, and the females will kind of hide under the cobble to prevent getting eaten by something like a bass. And then if the lake levels go down, this cobble habitat is again exposed to the air and not available for the crayfish. And so what these researchers think is that with the low water levels, they've lost their rearing areas, so they're not able to reproduce more young. But it takes a crayfish about 3 years to grow into an adult. And so these are the catch rates of adults in traps. So if the water levels were low, then 3 years later, you're going to see a decline in the adults because they weren't able to reproduce and kind of create the next adults for the future generation. So that is another interesting example of how these lake levels then affect the biology and what's going on in the lake. All right. And so I've talked to you, in detail about quite a few of these examples where you can see how lake levels influence the biology of fisheries and habitat, water quality. Some other things that I'm not really going to get too into detail with, but a lot of you can see this with your own eyes, that it affects our recreation and navigation. You can see like some people's houses are flooded, or septic systems might be flooded during the high years. You can have these erosion problems like you see here in this picture on Silver Lake. Sometimes lake groups institute slow no wake policies to try to protect the shorelines. And then during the low water years, like this example down here on the lower left, the piers can be left high and dry. So certainly the way people want to interact with the lake can also be affected by these lake level fluctuations. So then I'm going to transition. Were there any questions on these examples of how lake levels affect the biology of the lake? Okay. So then basically this all just begs for the need to have long-term lake level data. If you have the data, you can understand how it's changing over time, and you can understand how it's affecting other things like fish or invasive crayfish. It turns out that we don't have that much lake level data. I've got a map here showing the stream flow data. The U.S. Geological Survey does a lot of work all around the country, gauging streams and monitoring those. That's where you can see when floods occur and whatnot. The USGS monitors some lake levels, and they monitor some in Wisconsin. But as a whole, this is much less. This occurs much less frequently than looking at sites that monitor stream flow. So back in 2015, I did a little inventory of all the different places that were monitoring lake levels in Wisconsin and who was doing it. These were the sites that I found that had some long-term lake level records going. A lot of it is from USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey. And then there were a few volunteer monitoring efforts already going on. So all these red circles in Vilas County are volunteers monitoring with the North Lakeland Discovery Center, also with the help of UW-Madison's Trout Lake Field Station. And then in the orange, these are volunteers that were monitoring lake levels and stream flow. And I'll talk about that later. It's a little bit of a different approach. So, basically what I saw here, okay, we have some efforts going on in the state, but then again, there's a lot of the state that's blank. And so we started a lake level monitoring protocol that volunteers could use. So basically, you know, citizen scientists to the rescue. We already have a really vibrant water quality monitoring program where volunteers monitor SECI depth for water clarity and water chemistry. And we thought, well, let's develop methods so people can monitor lake levels as well. So we set out with some priorities for which lakes to choose. As I told you before, we know that seepage lakes vary a lot more than drainage lakes. So that was our first criteria. And then we wanted to try to fill in the gaps and get some areas of the state that really don't have anything going on in terms of lake level monitoring. We also, in that map, I'll just go back here really quick, all these green areas that you can kind of see underlined, those have sand and gravel up to 50 feet deep. So that means the soils are really porous and the groundwater can move very easily through those areas. So if there is groundwater pumping, they would be more responsive to the groundwater pumping. The lake would be. So that was another thing to look at those sort of regions. And then because this was a new effort, we were thinking, well, we could try to tack this on to some lakes that already have active volunteers and see if they'd be interested in monitoring lake levels in addition to something like water clarity. So these were the sites that we've started in the last few years. Yeah, you can see getting into some new areas, a lot of them more so in the north. And yeah, 34 lakes and 14 counties. And basically this is pretty simple, simple methods. You've got a staff gauge like the one you see here, and people just need to look at where the water level falls on that, on the staff gauge. So basically that ruler. But you know, there are quite a few different elements, and so I'm going to talk a little bit now in detail on the different elements and how to get involved and what we needed to create. So you know, one of the big challenges is just building the partnerships and getting the people. So I've got a picture up here on the left, the volunteers and coordinators. So getting people interested in doing this, and not only the volunteers themselves, but then some people from the county or from DNR who can help with establishing the site and getting the methods down and the training done. We wrote a volunteer lake level monitoring protocol, so that's there, and we also have a protocol for doing the surveys. And when we first started the project in 2015, excuse me, when we first started the project in 2015, we made a bunch of staff gauges that we could hand out to people. And I think the most challenging part, though, is bringing in the surveyors. So because we live in Wisconsin and our lakes freeze, we have to take the staff gauge out every winter. But to make a long-term record that we can tie together from year to year, we need to make sure when we put the gauge back in the spring that it's at the same elevation, or that it won't be exactly the same. So we need to know how much different it is, and then be able to make that correction factor. So the way we go about this then is establishing what we call a reference mark on land, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And then you use this auto level here to look at the elevation of that spot on land that's not changing, and then look at the elevation of the staff gauge. So the tricky part here is that you need a professional who has the equipment and the knowledge to do that part of the work, and that's usually where we're more limited as far as starting new sites. And then finally, of course, is data management. So we have our surface water information management system, SWIMS. That's where we have all our water quality data, and people enter, you know, their water clarity and other information. And so now we've also set up SWIMS to take in lake level data, and the volunteers can enter that. So that kind of just highlights all the different players. And we've laid out the division of responsibilities for everyone involved. So you'd have the surveyors, they come to the lake in the spring to install the staff gauge and they remove it in the fall. Sometimes the volunteers actually help or do that part of the job. But then the surveyors need to do that elevation correction each spring and fall and submit the data to our database. The volunteers' main job is to read the staff gauge, and we ask for them to do so every week if they can, and submit that data again to our data management system. Then we have volunteer coordinators, so people from DNR, some people from the counties that kind of help coordinate between the surveyors and the volunteers and make sure everyone knows what to do. And then we have staff like me at the DNR who kind of help oversee the whole thing and then do some of the database support and data analysis. If you were thinking about doing this, one of the things that we had to think about is, okay, if we want to start this on a new lake, this is Axe Handle Lake where we actually have a lake level gauge, where would we put the gauge? And we've been trying to put them at a place with public access. So a boat launch is often an obvious choice. The main reason to put it at a public site is that if the volunteer that initially signs on for it kind of loses energy or is for some reason unable to continue doing the work, then other people can help out without having to get onto private property. Or, or in the future, if someone else takes it over, then they can just go to the same site. Another thing that you could look at is whether there or not there are already existing benchmarks. Sometimes, when building roads or doing other activities, a county or someone else might have already put in a benchmark. So a lot of times that's a rod that's dug deep into the ground so that it won't move. And there's already an elevation, like linked to sea level elevation available for the site. Sometimes we do still put the lake level staff gauge on someone's private property. So the volunteer where they live, then they can just go out their door and to the lake shore to take the reading. And we've already had, in the cases where we've done that, we've already had examples where the person wasn't able to continue but found another volunteer from elsewhere on the lake. And so then we have to do the extra survey work to try to keep the record continuous. So basically, if they've got a benchmark on their land, then we got to figure out what that elevation is and then figure out the elevation across the lake so that we can link those records together. Another thing to look at is the bathymetry. So if the lake is a really shallow, if it has a really shallow gradual slope, then when the lake level goes down, your staff gauge could be left high and dry. So you kind of want an area that has a more steep drop off so that you can monitor the lake levels even at high or low levels. Another thing, it's kind of nice to go to boat launches, but on the other hand, they've got a lot of traffic and we have had gauges get bumped, probably not on purpose, but if somebody doesn't see it or maybe someone's curious about it and goes up and touches it and then it kind of gets banged, and that will, of course, affect the record because you don't want that thing to move. And substrate too, you need something that's if it's too soft and mucky, then the staff gauge won't be solidly placed in the ground. On the other hand, if it's bedrock, you won't be able to pound it into the ground. Oh, maybe this is where I have that. Yeah, okay. So this is just showing you the site. So let's say you're going to put the staff gauge in here, and then you would have 3 reference marks on land that you get the elevations of. And it could be something, a nail in the tree is not the best, but it could be okay. It's just what if the tree falls down? Something that's, like pounded into asphalt or a stake, like I say, a long stake pounded deep into the ground is something better. And so what the surveyor will do, they'll set up their auto level here, and then they can shoot one that the elevation of the auto level won't change, and then they can look at the relative elevations of each of these reference marks and the staff gauge to figure out what the elevation is at the bottom of the staff gauge. And so the surveyor will do that twice. They'll set up their auto level in one location and shoot all those elevations, and then they'll do it at another. And they should get the same elevation. So that's kind of one of our quality assurance measures to make sure we're getting a good elevation. Then the volunteer, the staff gauge is in the water, the volunteer will monitor the lake levels, and pretty much asking people to do it every week, and watching, if it's a really windy day with big waves, it's not the best time to take a lake level reading. You can see the water sometimes will go up and down quite a bit. So a calm day is preferable, but other than that, the only other thing we really ask is to be watching if it looks like the staff gauge got moved, it's really at an angle or something, then we want the surveyor to come back out and make sure that it's still at the same elevation. And if not, they'll redo the survey, and we'll probably have to throw out a little bit of data to make sure we have good quality data. This just shows you an example. I haven't processed the data from the last few years, but these are some lakes that were started, and you can see, the lake levels in 2015, and then in 2016. You can see that as a whole, most of the lakes got, the lake level got higher on most of the lakes between the 2 years, but then you can also see some different seasonal things happening, a little bit of variation between the lakes. So let's see, I've got 10 minutes left or so. So one of the things, we've already started new sites. We now, want to have this open to more volunteers. So if people want to start monitoring lake levels on their lake, they're welcome to. But we're less able now to keep offering all the same services. So essentially, if you want to do it, we can offer to give you training and data support and kind of help you through the process. But then you, the volunteer and the lake level organization, would build your own staff gauge, find a surveyor in your area who could do the survey work, and you'd pay for that yourself, and then record and enter the data. One other thing I just wanted to mention briefly, so that kind of describes the way we do the lake level monitoring with the staff gauges. In the central sands part of the state, kind of in the middle of the state, we also, as I mentioned before, have a bunch of monitoring going on there, both for stream flow and lake levels. And here the soils are really sandy and gravelly, and so instead of using staff gauges, the volunteers have these shallow groundwater wells on their properties, and they just monitor the depths of the groundwater, which is usually pretty similar to what the lake level is. So some things we've learned about volunteer monitoring in general, but this also applies to lakes, is that there's also got to be something in it for the volunteers, and we sometimes fall behind in what we'd all like to do, but some of the things we try to do is, volunteers want to know, okay, what is my data showing? So if we can analyze the data, create graphs, and talk about what trends we're seeing on the lakes, that's really important. Another thing is to have materials available so that people can then take it back to their lake association meetings or other places to share the results. So this is an example of that central Wisconsin part of the state I was talking about, where you can see all these lake level records that we have for the different counties. And then really, just more generally, how is my data being used? And so I gave you quite a few examples in the beginning of the talk today about what we're learning about lake levels in Wisconsin, and we wouldn't be able to learn that stuff without the data. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that we can set out to monitor lake levels with a specific purpose of, maybe managing the lake levels on that lake, or trying to build a model to predict lake levels over time. But then as it turns out, with long-term records in general, new questions will arise in the future that we didn't even anticipate, and these long-term records often serve a great purpose. They're, you know, they're often able to answer questions in the future that we didn't anticipate having. So I do have a few more slides, but I guess pause one more time if there's questions about lake level monitoring in particular.
We have one question here. It's, is your lake level predictive model available to lake associations to play with?
Not yet. I don't know if it will be, but we still need to write the paper, and we're still kind of working on it. But that would be a really cool idea. I like that. Okay, so then just to wrap things up here in the last few minutes, I know a lot of people are concerned about the high water levels right now. In the future, we can expect there to be another drought and low levels. And this is some work we've been doing. I've cited a paper here that Madeline McGee and others wrote about how to adapt to climate change. And one of the things we did in that paper was look in particular at lake levels and how climate change could affect lake levels. And so I just wanted to leave you with a few of these thoughts. We can look at different ways of adapting to fluctuating lake levels: communication, policy, engineering, and conservation. So from a communication side of things, you know, that's what I've been trying to do a little bit today, is just setting expectations, knowing that lake levels change, and on some lakes they'll change a lot and other lakes a little. So if you were to buy a property on a lake, 1 year, that's not necessarily, and most likely will not be, the lake level that you'll always see on that lake. And so setting expectations, if you monitor lake levels, and of course you'll better be able to see how they're changing and what to expect on the lake. And then also another thing here, I've got this picture on the right of a property where you can see a really natural shoreline. So you could imagine here, if the lake levels fluctuate quite a bit, that their property won't be damaged, and you've got some nice plants there and everything to hold the soil in, so it'll be more resilient to change. And then if we look at conservation practices, a lot of things here are just protecting that riparian habitat, that area close to the interface between the lake and the land, and allowing it to change over time. And also leaving the habitat there. So, we've got this drought period with all the woody habitat exposed. If you go out there and clean it up and take it out, then when the water levels rise again, it won't be there for the fish and other animals. And then things like water conservation practices, so conservation tillage and leaving residue crops, those things will help reduce runoff and help water infiltrate, so that the lake levels shouldn't be as flashy. We can get into things like policy measures, so zoning regulations, how near can you build towards shore, or building in floodplains, just making sure that those areas that would naturally have water sometimes then don't have people's valuables being built there, so that they don't get damaged. So there's a regulatory side, and then there's also incentives that could be used. And here's an example of porous pavements. So again, just trying to deal with these stormwater flows and reduce the runoff, so that you see, so lakes can respond more gradually to change. And then finally, there's more of the engineering side of things. So how can we engineer our way to some solutions? Something like piers, well, make floating piers or rolling piers, so you can change those with the changing water levels. Water infiltration practices, again, a lot of our lakes have dams on them, and so thinking ahead about how to manage those lake levels properly. And then, the more extreme cases where people in some lakes are actually pumping the water out during high water levels. So there's a lot of other kinds of responses here in terms of engineering solutions. And then I see I'm almost out of time, so I'll just end here with this slide, kind of big picture. The way I think about water levels and lakes in the state is that we need more lake level monitoring in the state. our models are also really helpful. So if we can get a little bit of data and then we can model what lake levels are, then we can say how much a lake would naturally vary over time, which could help us better understand, you know, how the lake is changing in terms of its ecology. And then also it can help us set management targets and better, you know, have better water quantity policies for lakes in the state. So with that, I will end, and well, maybe 2 minutes for questions.
We had one question here. Do you have a general idea of what the cost might be to a lake association for surveying and installation of a gauge?
Yeah, it might vary depending on who you can find a survey, but more like on the order of a couple $100. It's not that expensive. And usually, like if there was someone in the area, they'd probably spend almost just as much time driving to the lake as, you know, actually doing the survey. Oh, I see someone else said they put about 1,000. Was that for both the spring and the fall? And I know Peggy had said if you want, you could unmute yourself and ask the question out loud. Oh, that was just for the spring.
All right. And if we don't have any other questions, I'll just say thank you, Katie, for that great presentation. Please join us for the Thursday keynote speaker, Dr. Douglas Beard, at 9 o'clock using the link in the virtual agenda page. Paul had also posted it as well earlier in the chat. And then we hope to see you back here in the Monitoring to Action stream at 10:40 for more presentations. All right, thank you, everyone.